Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Orlando Castellan, and from the Center for Charter Schools, Director for Board Governance. We are so excited and pleased to have you here today joining us for our Board Development Series webinar, Navigating Your Board Role Effectively. Just sharing a few logistical items with everyone before we begin today. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website for those who, for your partners on the board that weren't able to make it today. When the webinar concludes, there'll be an evaluation that comes up on your screen. We ask that you complete this brief survey as we take that feedback into consideration for future events, and I really need to hear from you some feedback on how we can continue to get better. So, and then if at any time you have questions that you'd like to ask the presenter, please utilize the question and answer feature in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We would appreciate if you would do that. And so with that, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest today, Mike Mizzoni, the Chief Governance Officer for BoardOnTrack. Mike joins the BoardOnTrack team with professional experience in higher education, board governance, law, and state and local politics. And so we're so pleased to have Mike on the line, sharing his expertise with us today. Thank you, Mike.
Awesome. Thank you, Orlando. Thanks so much for the invitation. I always love to join you and your group out there. At BoardOnTrack, we're a national organization, and so we work with authorizers around the country. And the team over here at CMU with Orlando, Shannon, Martha, the rest of the group there, it's hands down one of the best authorizers that we work with. And so whenever we get to come in here and, and promote good governance with an organization like this, we really enjoy it. I'm not going to keep my camera on the whole time, but I just wanted to say hello and everyone to be able to put a face to the name. So really excited again to be here today. Here's what we're looking to cover in the time that we have this afternoon. I'm going to start off with some introductory framing thoughts and talk a little bit about who I am, who BoardOnTrack is, and then just really frame what this whole discussion is about and what it really means, starting at the very beginning, what it means to be a charter school board. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this thing that we call the governance team. And, a lot of times when we do our work here at BoardOnTrack, we hear a lot about this notion about, the board and the CEO or our management organization and the staff. And what we want to try and clarify is exactly who is on the governance team for you. And, just to give you a peek down to the next chapter, really the answer is that it is more than just your board members who should be a part of that team. Then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this thing that we call governance and management. You may have heard about governance versus management or the governance management line. We really like to avoid the governance versus management notion because that helps to perpetuate this feeling that it's the board work on one side and the CEOs or the staff doing something completely different. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and break down the governance management line as best as we can. And then we're going to go into some mini case studies. And we've got three little very real world feeling examples of where the governance management line meets the road quite often. And if we have some time, if we have good participation, we can even talk through a couple of those together as a team. Then finally, now that we've really talked for a moment about what governance is as compared to management, we're going to go in and just go through some high-level board roles and responsibilities, and really some of those high-level things that the board is responsible for. Throughout the presentation, I really, really enjoyed, as Orlando said, for chats and questions to come in. I like to spend your valuable board member time as efficiently as possible. And so that means that I would rather answer a real life question that somebody on this presentation has than just go through what I have in my presentation. I'm pretty good and light on my feet. So I've actually got, right now, I've got both the Q&A and our chat functions up in WebEx, so please feel free to let those fire away. And I've got the team, Martha and the team at CMU helping me out with that as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I have to confess, I'm using this WebEx screen share for the first time, and so I might not be, this will be the first time I'm walking through this presentation using this system, so bear with me if we have any technical glitches. So like Orlando said, my name is Mike Mizzoni. I'm our Chief Governance Officer here at our organization called BoardOnTrack. If you haven't heard of our organization before, we have our roots in a traditional charter school board consulting organization. So we were founded right around, the start of the charter movement, and there was really nobody else who was putting a spotlight on good governance. And so we started as a consulting organization, and what we would do is we found that we would go out and we would do trainings just like these. We'd run board retreats and other workshops over the summer, and we'd have all of these good board members who were nodding their head and saying, yep, this is great, we've got this. But then we'd come back and we'd meet with them a year later, and we found that there really wasn't as much progress as we expected to make. And so what we found is that boards really do need to have a spotlight on good governance, and they need an ongoing partner and expertise throughout the year in how to get that good work done. And so that's how BoardOnTrack was born. We really just are promoting the notion of good boards deliver exceptional results. And so that's why we love organizations like CMU that put a spotlight on good governance and prioritize that in the charter sector. So now really getting into the substance here. I like I said, to start off at the very highest level to just level set about what exactly is this board here to do and why do we exist. And so at its most basic sense, the relationship between the board and the authorizer is why your board exists. So the authorizer, in this case for all of you at CMU, Central Michigan University, they have said that what we are going to do is we are going to allow you, a group of private individuals, we're going to allow you to go out and educate our students, the students of our community. And in order to do that, we are going to allow you to have the kind of autonomy. I'm going to see if I can pull up sometimes it allows me to use a highlighter here. We're going to give you this autonomy to go out and do these kinds of things, right? To come up with your own school program, to have some flexibility when it comes to your finances, to have more flexibility when it comes to your staffing. And we're going to allow you, this private group of people, to educate our students. But in exchange for this autonomy that we're going to give you, we are going to hold you as the charter board accountable to certain things. And that may look different based on every authorizer around the country and maybe even every charter agreement that exists out there. But typically, we look at things like the mission. What is it that you're setting out to do as an organization? How are you going to educate our students in an effective way? There's often things about organizational sustainability. How are you going to run your organization? What are the finances going to look like? What are the operations going to look like? Ultimately, it often draws back to student outcomes, specific promises that you as the charter board are making to your authorizer that you're going to do. And all of this happens in this relationship that's a back and forth relationship between the authorizer and the board, which is the charter contract. And so the reason why this board exists, it exists to participate in this relationship with the authorizer, where in exchange for the autonomy to go out and do some really good work, the board is going to, in exchange, provide accountability in some of these really key areas. And so that's kind of the heart of this relationship. It's a contractual arrangement between an authorizer, the government entity, and a charter school board. And the reason why this is so important is it's a reminder to everybody that it's the board, not the staff, not the CMO. It's the board that owns the legal responsibility for accountability. This slide, it typically comes up not all at once, but with this little system, I don't have the ability to do the built-in. So this slide here, what I ask people when I travel around, or at least pre-COVID, in the before times we used to get to travel around, but whenever I do workshops with people and I ask them, what really is your charter school board? We often get responses that sound something like this. Oftentimes it can get boiled down to, we're a really well-meaning group of volunteers that are here to lead this school. And while that's not untrue, we really want you to be thinking about the fact that you as a board really need to be thinking about yourselves as a highly effective team that's been strategically assembled to bring the skills, expertise, temperament, and time that are required to govern a multi-million-dollar public enterprise. Because that's what your organization is. when you participate in this arrangement and you get this charter contract and you are the school board here, well, you are the board of directors of a multi-million-dollar public enterprise. And so when I give this line typically in a live audience or in front of a workshop of real people, I often see their heads nod as I get to this last part of the slide. And I reinforce to folks the reminder that this is a real professional responsibility. It's not just a hobby. It's not just, you shouldn't think of your board work as the same as the PTO's work. This is real governance that we need to be focusing and prioritizing. And to that end, the way that governance evolves looks really unique because of charter schools. So, like Orlando had mentioned, I've got some experience with schools. I've only worked with school boards in my experience as an attorney, both in higher ed and in the K through 12 level. And what's really unique to charter school boards is that they're still creating these governing boards. The school board that I served on was a traditional district board that had been around for, decades and had the support of our municipality. Most charter school boards don't have that benefit. So whether you're a brand new organization or you've been around for 5 or 10 years, it's important to think about how is the work that you're doing as a governing team evolving at the same rate that the organization is evolving. And so when we talk about good governance, we're talking about going from a basic board that tends to operate in a reactive kind of mindset. They tend to be ad hoc. They tend to rely on the heroics of a handful of board members. And what we want you to be thinking about is how your governance work can evolve to a position where you're really contributing to strong academic results with the organization. And that these results are repeatable and they're predictable. And a lot of this has to do with the board spending most of its time on longer term strategic work, right? Planning for the future of the success of this organization versus just dealing with the here and now. And many people may hear me saying this and be, nodding their head or rolling their eyes and say, well, yeah, that's kind of obvious. But you'd be surprised that when we ask board members, based on knowing nothing else and just seeing what's on this screen right now, where would you think that your board, your governance team would fall on this spectrum? And when we ask people this, and I'm actually curious to everybody who's on this presentation right now, if you are up for it, I would love for you to answer this question right now, either typing in something to the chat or saying on the audio, if that's possible. I'd be very curious to see, based on your experience, where would you think your board and your CEO fall on this spectrum? And the reason why that question is so, it invites so much conversation is because when we ask people, we say, I see a couple responses coming in right now, so that's great. Keep on coming with those. We ask people, we say, how good is your board? And they say, we're great. We'd probably be an advanced board or maybe intermediate or excellent. And when I ask them, well, what do you mean by that? The answers tend to be very shallow. And so there are some very particular things that good governing boards do to make sure that they're adding value to this whole process versus just being either the dreaded rubber stamp or even worse, actively getting in the way of the work that your staff and your school are doing. So curious to see, if anybody else chimes in. Like we were saying, boards up here tend to have, like we were saying, repeatable, outstanding results. They've got all of the board work is no longer about the people. It's about the work that's getting done. So it's about the processes. There's the right committees and the right structure, and it kind of really is humming on all cylinders. So thank you for those of you who sent in an answer to where you think, your gut tells you might fall on that continuum. All right. And so that's why this conversation is really important, is because in order for this work to get done, it's really important that the board understands how it fits into this bigger puzzle. And oftentimes we talk about this as this notion of shared governance. And if you haven't heard of the notion of shared governance before, you've definitely seen it. So shared governance is this notion that entities, organizations are really well served when you match up a group of disinterested, not uninterested, but disinterested people from a wide variety of backgrounds, and you match them up with a paid professional expert who is like, the captain of the ship to get this good work done. You see it with corporate boards, right? You've got a board of directors, and then you've got a CEO. You see it with nonprofit entities, a charitable board. They'll have a board and a board of directors and an executive director. And it's no different with a charter school. We've got two sides of the same coin that make up this thing that we call the governance team. So who's on your governance team? Well, the reason why this is important is because governance is really a balancing act. And so, as we say here, charter organizations are really led by two equally important sides of the coin. There's the board, and then there's the leadership. And it's really this whole group, so both sides of the coin, that are responsible for helping organizations be successful. And so when we work with good boards, we can point to the best charter school boards around the country that lead to really great high-performing organizations. And those great boards really have a balance between both sides of these coins. Unfortunately, many organizations make the mistake of letting this relationship get out of whack. And what it leads to is all of the problems that lead to the unfortunate reality of when a charter school closes. The unfortunate reality is that almost every reason why a charter school closes can be traced back to some sort of action, or oftentimes more frequently inaction on the part of the board. And so what we tend to see is, organizations that either look like the rubber stamp, where they're not involved enough and the organization is just run by the CMO or the staff, and that can be a risky proposition. And then on the other end of the pendulum, or the other end of the spectrum, we have boards that are way too involved in managing and operating the organization. And again, that leads to major risk to the organization as well. So what we like to say here at BoardOnTrack is that governance is a team sport. I apologize, this side over here got a little wonky. But two sides of the same coin is really the way that we like to think of it. And so it's a team sport, and that's why we call this work the governance team. The governance team is everybody who's a part of this coin. So on one side, you've got all of your board members, the board itself, right? So you've got your voting trustees, and what else you may have, and I'm curious if anybody would, I'd love to know, and so feel free to type this into the chat or to the Q&A function as well. I'm very curious if any of your boards out there have non-voting committee members that participate. These would be people who serve on your committees, but they don't have a full vote on the board itself. A lot of boards are doing this nowadays as a really great way. It's one of our favorite tips for recruiting good board members and to building out a good human capital pipeline is to build out your committees and round out your committees with some non-board members. So let's say you've got a fundraising committee. Parents make great fundraising committee members because they may not want to serve on the board because of a conflict of interest or something, but they might be able to give tons of time toward your fundraising effort. On the other side of the coin, and this is the really important part, is that the other side of your coin includes more than just your school leader. So the management team oftentimes includes at the top of the organizational chart your school leader. At BoardOnTrack, you may hear us refer to that person as the CEO or the executive director. The important piece here is that as your organization grows and scales up this path to excellence, the board work needs to become more complex. What do I mean by this? Well, when you're a brand new organization and you're going doors open, or maybe you've been just open for a year or two, you may not need a full complement of committees. You know, your work of developing your budget may not be as difficult. You may not have as complex facilities problems. But as your organization grows, and maybe you are growing and replicating and expanding, adding grade levels or students, the work is going to be more complex, and it's simply not possible or efficient to get all of this work done at full board meetings. And so it necessitates the need for committees. And when you have committees, that necessitates bringing in additional staff support onto the work of the board. And so committees are really the engines of good board work. And I see a couple people chiming in that we even have, we have committees. And it's really important that as your work of the organization grows, that you can offline some of that board work to committees. But when you do that, it can create really impressive or important time constraints on the point of the school leader. And we don't want to do that. So what we want to do is bring in people like the CFO or a budget manager, or maybe you have a development director or a principal, people who are experts in their more of a niche field. You want to get them involved in the board work. And so they become part of what we call the governance team. So it's the school leader, but then also some of those key staff members who should be involved with that work. What we don't like to see is when boards are really good about putting up lots of committees, but then they don't have the right support, or it just creates major burdens on the school leader to staff those committees and to provide the support they need. So I would encourage you in your organization to really think about where your organization's, what your organization's governance team looks like. Who are the board members? Who are the non-board members that might fall into this side of the category? And who exactly are on the staff side as well. And the reason why it's important is because when you have two sides of the coin, this is how good board work gets done. It's when we take all of the issues and we say, what is it that we need from the management team, and what is it that we need from the board team in order to be successful? So here would be, a little example of this team approach. Let's say when it comes to, something very simple, let's take budget development and approval. We know, right, that the budget approval process ultimately is the responsibility of the board, right? The boards ultimately are responsible for approving the budget. And that's really for any entity, not just for charter school boards, right? If you think back to a corporate board, a charitable board, or nonprofit. But going back to this slide here about this being the notion of shared governance, we rely on our management team to be the captains of this ship. Going back to the example, we want a group of disinterested lay people who come from a vast variety of backgrounds to team up with that expert staff to help us get this good work done. And so the board, while they approve the budget ultimately, we don't expect boards to start from scratch with a blank spreadsheet and just develop this budget by themselves. It's really a partnership with the management team. And many of you, this will resonate with you if you've been through a budget approval process before. Oftentimes what we see is a staff, maybe a CFO and the CEO, they might draft an initial budget, and they may work with a finance committee to come up with some, answer some strategic questions with the finance committee. Then the finance committee and the staff may bring that to the full board. And at that point, they may get the weigh-in of the full board. But you can see that this is a collaborative process. We see it a lot with fundraising. Some boards, need to do fundraising in order to close the gap and make their mission successful. And so good organizations that we see, they say, let's say we need to get $10,000. Well, how much of that can you and the staff fundraise through, grants and things like that? And how much can the board fundraise with things like, individual contributions and things like that? So all of the work when the board and the organization are getting prepped for the year, maybe you've had your board retreat for the year, whenever you're getting ready to set your goals and identify what work you need to do for the year, it's important that you pause and you say, what is it that we as the board need to accomplish? And what is it that we as the staff need to accomplish? And where are their interdependencies? And let's talk about that. So just to kind of level set, on the board side, what we're talking about really here are those full voting board members, and we need to make sure that that we're large enough to do the substantive work that I talked about in between meetings to partner with the staff. We want to see that those committees then are aligned to the work that the full organization is doing. And oftentimes, if we need to, one of the first questions we get asked is, how could we have really active committees if we don't have enough people on our board? So maybe you only have 7 or 9 people on your board, but you've got 5 committees. Well, one of the best tools you can do is to bring in non-voting board members to round out that team. And then on the board leadership side, obviously we've got our board chair. I like to highlight the chair of the governance committee because that's really related to a lot of the work that we're talking about today. And then, of course, your other committee chairs and officers as well. On the staff side, the management side, we're talking, at the top right is the CEO. We like to see organizations with pretty clear reporting structures. And so, whether this person is really a CEO or it's a CMO, and it's your support organization that you contract with, it's just important to have an image in your mind as to, what exactly is the management team structure for your organization, because that'll be having clarity on who's on the team and who makes up that team is going to be the first step in understanding the governance management line that we're going to get into in just a second. In addition to, organizations that may have a CEO, or if you've got a CMO, you'll understand that you've got all of these roles in there as well. They might have different terms, and they might be called something different, but you're going to have a person who is primarily responsible for managing the books and the finances day to day. That might be a staff member at your CMO. It may be a back office accounting firm. It may be an on-site, local business manager. That is often the person who's going to be meeting with the finance committee to develop the budget. And so that's, it's important to think about how they are folding into this governance team. We're not going to spend much time on this one, right? Most people know the role of the board chair and how they fit into this puzzle. The board chair is the chief volunteer leader of the organization. So they're not a paid employee, they're a volunteer, but it's important to note that they don't have any more power or a stronger vote than anybody else on the board. So they're responsible for facilitating good board work, helping to empower and lead the board members to get good work done. Really running a group processes is really the kind of thing that you want to look at with the role of the board chair. Being able to keep groups of volunteer board members moving and rowing all in the same direction. The role of the school leader or the staff, on that side, it's probably the most difficult role in this puzzle to get right, because of the fact that boards are really only as good as the staff support that they get. But the leadership team, the staff, whether it's a CEO, an executive director, or whatever the relationship is with your CMO, they often have to walk this tightrope of both, like I said, being the captain of the ship, but then also taking direction from the board. And boards are, like I said, are only as good as the staff support that they have. And so it's really important that on the leadership side of things, that, we're getting clarity, who's responsible for supporting our committees? What is the role of each of our staff members in supporting the work? And do our board members know so that they don't overstep their boundaries when it comes to communication protocols within the organization? There's this kind of silly metaphor that I have to help think of this relationship in the difficulty here. And I keep talking about the captain of the ship. And even, big vessels, big shipping vessels, they often have a charter. They're allowed to authorize, and that charter is granted to a group of people. They may own that ship, but those people are almost always not the people who are actually sailing that ship. What do? They hire a captain. That captain doesn't own the ship, but they're responsible for getting it from one place to another. And so it's a collaboration. The owners of the vessel are going to say it needs to get here, and they're going to point on a map. And we're going to rely on the captain to say, great, me and my crew are going to get you there, and here's how I recommend that we get there. And so it's important that everybody knows their role in this work. Before I start breaking any more of this out and we start talking about the difference between governance and management, and I start to do the frustrating effort of breaking this apart, I hope that you don't get frustrated, but people tend to, because there isn't really good black and whites here. Let me pause and see. I'm curious from everyone so far. Does any of this resonate with you so far? Do you have any questions about, why this is important? how we make up these teams, anything like that. I'll just pause for a moment, take a sip of my water, and then see if there are any questions or comments.
Hey, Mike, if you do see some questions on there or chats, you might want to repeat the question because a lot of people cannot see the chat feature or the Q&A feature.
Awesome.
Really can't see if people are asking questions is basically what I'm saying.
Awesome. Good help for that. Awesome. And not a question, but a comment that I just got that I think is just spurred a thought for me that I think is worth repeating. And I'll say it again in a moment, but this is really good stuff that may seem, and it is very simple stuff, right? It's not complicated. It's just really about how we handle this and simplify it for our own teams. And so I highly encourage for you all who are passionate about good governance and want to get this right, to take some of these conversations that I'm having with you right now and to take them back to your board. And when we get to the mini case studies in a moment, those might be a good avenue for you to do that. But the best way to deal with this stuff, as we're going to talk about in just a second, is to just talk about it and to rip the Band-Aid off. Excuse me. Just pause for another moment, see any other questions or comments, and then we'll keep going. All right. Let's keep moving along then. So the governance and management. I have it here as governance versus management, just to remind me to say the comment that I made at the beginning, which is that I don't like saying governance versus management because it perpetuates the notion that these really are separate entities, and it's not. This is just the same group all trying to get the same work done just by playing different roles and sitting in different seats. The thing about the governance management line, and I mentioned that can be frustrating sometimes, is that the governance management line is just filled with different shades of gray. And this notion of what governance is and what management is going to look different based on every organization because of the way that it's structured, because of its mission, whether you've got in-house staff, whether you work with a CMO, all of that is going to affect how governance and management works for your group. And then it's also going to be impacted based on where you are on this path to excellence, because the work of governance and management evolves all the time. It's a very amorphous creation. And so, when we work with boards that are, say, brand new, basic boards, it's very common for charter school board members to be rolling up their sleeves and to be much more involved in management type work. We hear stories about board members rolling up their sleeves and painting the library walls or helping to manage the finances, as they're getting their books up and running. Well, that is management type activity, but you certainly do not want to be doing that. That is not the goal, right? Boards really should be marching back as they evolve this path to excellence. They should be marching back towards governance, and then trying to always keep an eye on not overstepping into management, right? And not stepping on the toes of the management and the staff, but also not becoming like I keep saying, the dreaded rubber stamp, or a board that's, asleep at the wheel, so to speak. So if I go back here and we talk about governance versus management, this is a part, I typically like to step through these, and I don't have those built in. So there's a lot on here, but I'm going to go through the top, from the top to the bottom. So let's start up here. Conceptually, it's very, very obvious, right? It seems very simple. Boards are here to govern, and the leadership team is here to manage. And that's where we come up with the terms governance versus management. Well, if we go and drill down a little bit more, what is governance? Governance is all about planning and creating the framework for great work to be done. So again, going all the way back to the first slide here, the board is all about planning for the future and making sure that we can be strategic and consistently leading to strong academic results. And so the board's job is to always be looking at the horizon and creating the framework for good work to be done. The management team's responsibility is all about executing and supporting on the strategic vision that we had. So again, think of the captain of the ship. The captain's job is to hire the crew and to sail this ship to where we've agreed we want to head to. So boards should provide leadership for the organization and strategy, but while they're doing that, they should be focusing really only on the big picture. That's our goal here. We want them to be steering clear from day-to-day decisions and execution. They don't operate the school, right? They provide leadership and strategy and vision and direction. And then the management team actually operates the schools within the classroom. So one way to think about this kind of, again, big picture, stepping back and, trying to think of different ways of framing these very kind of nebulous concepts is that boards focus on the results and leadership focus on the means. So again, the board members, they point on the map, and then the leadership team says, great, here's how I think I'm going to get you there. Any questions before I go? And we're going to break it down again just a little bit more on this next slide. But please be, if any of this is clear, as you can see, I'm speaking in very vague terms because, again, it's a very vague concept, and it's all about finding what does, focusing on the results mean for your organization versus focusing on the means. So what I try to do here is, try and provide as many of the black and white kinds of things that we can as possible in these different areas. So, obvious couple of things. Accountability, we talked about that. Accountability is the purview ultimately of the board. When it comes to accountability, the buck stops with the board. Going back to my very first slide showing that relationship between the authorizer and the board, we know that accountability is key. The board ultimately is responsible for developing but then approving the mission, the culture, the core values of the organization. The boards, they set policies. That's the way that they do their work. They might set broad policies for the organization. And one thing that we know for certain is that the boards are responsible for allocating resources. So they are responsible for making sure that there is a budget, that there are sufficient finances in place in order to achieve the mission that we've set out to achieve. So part of what we need to do here, let's say that we're going to have, I was working actually recently with a board with an organization in Wisconsin, and they are an advanced manufacturing STEM high school. And so what that means is that in order to fulfill their mission of being a STEM school, they have some very expensive laboratory equipment and manufacturing equipment that they need. And so that goes beyond the reimbursement that they get from their state. And so they go out and they actually have to do some significant fundraising in order to fulfill their mission. But while the board allocates those resources, on the staff side, it's the management team who actually deploys those resources. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you are a board member, you should not have a school credit card and be going out to actually purchase, say, the textbooks or the Chromebooks for the classroom. It should always be a staff member who's actually going out and deploying these resources. And that's the difference, again, between actually leading the ship as a board member versus captaining the ship as a staff member. Board members are staff is all about execution, the operations of the school. And one of these areas that's pretty clearly black and white is when it comes to staffing. Staffing is really a leadership, a management issue to deal with. So we expect, the senior leader in your organization to hire other staff members, not, the board members should not be hiring teachers on your team. Just to frustrate you a little bit, I'll take that one very clear example that I said is pretty black and white, and I'll gray it up for you. I'll muddy it up for you a little bit. While staffing is almost always, the purview of the management team, what I like to say is that everything on this side of the coin, on this side of the Venn diagram, it might ultimately be the final vote or responsibility of the board, but none of this stuff happens without the advice and counsel of the management team. And similarly, while all of this stuff might ultimately be the purview of the staff, it would be uncommon for them to do this work without the advice and the counsel of the board. So here's an example. When it comes to staffing, ultimately the decision will be up to, your CEO to hire the principal or the budget manager. But it's not uncommon to have for senior level positions, let's say you're hiring a CFO, it's not uncommon to have a board member sit on a search committee. And that board member might provide some advice and some counsel to the CEO, but then ultimately they're not responsible for hiring that person. It would be the CEO who does that. So I hope that what you can start to see is that, really in the middle here, we've got the strategic vision, this partnership in the middle. And then on the sides, we get some things that tend to be much more of either management or governance. But this thing can't be governance versus management because it really is, multiple overlapping responsibilities. So now what I want to do is I want to go through some of these mini case studies. And in the interest of time, because I want to make sure that we're pausing and able to talk about questions and answers, and also to give an opportunity for us to talk about next steps on how you can put this work into action with your team. We may not go through each of these 3 case studies in depth, especially because this isn't like a roundtable kind of conversation that really lends itself to. But I think it's really important to include them in this session because I think this will be one of your best tools in going back and having these conversations with your colleagues on your board. Governance and management issues, they're very difficult to predict, but you're absolutely going to feel them. So, I served for 4.5 years as a school board member myself. I've also been legal counsel for a board, and I understand, I've seen, some of these real life issues. Here's an example of a real life issue that I dealt with several times as a board member myself, and why it becomes important for where the rubber meets the road. Just about every year, most schools, but at least with mine, at the end of the school year, there would be some sort of a beloved teacher or staff member who was not renewed or was not returning the following year for one reason or another. Could have been because of a disciplinary issue, could have been for financial reasons. And so what inevitably would happen is my phone would start ringing from concerned parents and students who, they would say that, this staff member was the best staff member in the school, and they changed their students' life, and, they have to be returning next year. And it's important that board members understand, well, what is my responsibility now that I've heard this concern? Because, what you don't want to see is a board member calling up. What you can't see is a board member getting on the phone, calling the principal and saying, hey, you've got to hire this person back. Because that is absolutely not the responsibility of a charter board member. And so what we want to know is to be able to predict these issues so that we understand how it's appropriate to handle them with our team if they come up. And so it may seem like a silly exercise, but I promise that the only way to kind of get boards talking about these kind of sensitive issues is to talk about how would we handle a real life issue if it were to come before us. So let's talk about this first one real briefly. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. We're talking about a fundraising goal. Think about that advanced manufacturing board that I just talked about. They've got to do some fundraising. They have struggled to hit their portion of the target. So what we decided to do is we're going to hire a director of development. A couple months into the job, the board is feeling dissatisfied because they're not knocking it out of the park. When push comes to shove, the CEO defends the staff member. Tension is mounting. What happens next? So what are some things that you and your team should be thinking about? Well, I would invite you to consider exactly where is the governance management line? Where would this fall on this spectrum? I would encourage you to think that it's probably less clear than you're thinking about it right now with your gut reaction, because there are some things that I could throw, at you to maybe make you second guess yourself. So, where is the governance management line? Well, there's a staffing question involved. We've talked about staffing being largely a management issue. Okay. Well, then what about the notion of allocating resources? We talked about how one of the responsibilities of the board is making sure that there's enough resources. And well, in this case, they're not hitting their fundraising goal, and so that's why this person was brought in. Maybe the board needs to really step up its involvement in this issue because it gets to the heart of one of their missions. How about accountability? How about measuring this person's performance? whose job is it to measure the performance of staff members? We talked about how accountability is ultimately the responsibility of the board, but does that mean that that board should be evaluating their performance? The answer is almost always no, right? We typically expect the board to evaluate the CMO or the CEO, but not any other staff members below that. So what would be any recourse for the board? What's the CEO's role? Is there a role for the board? I'd be curious, to see how you could take this and adapt it and bring it back to your team. My gut tells me there is no very clear answer here, but we talked about how the CEOs are responsible for staffing, and ultimately boards don't really have the power to hire and fire staff members below the top of the organizational chart. And so maybe it's appropriate for a board member to raise some concerns and to, encourage the CEO to implement a really great performance evaluation, and maybe to set some goals for this person. Maybe this actually comes up at the CEO's end of the year evaluation that the board does. Those are all some things that you might want to consider. This next one, we wrapping up the school year, getting ready to go into next year, and we found out, we're really shocked on the board to hear that 60% of our teachers are not going to be returning next year. Same question. Same types of questions at least. What is the role of the CEO here? What's the role of the staff, the management team? What would be the role of the board now that they've heard this? If you were on this board, how would you react? What questions would you ask to your CEO or to the rest of your team? Again, we've gone back to this notion that staffing is a management issue. Well, maybe we want to know, obviously 60% turnover is massive. And so maybe the board really needs to dig its fingers in, because it could be a major, risk for the organization. Maybe the reason why 60% of the board members are not returning is because maybe the salary and compensation aren't strong enough. And maybe the board hasn't done a sufficient job of allocating resources. Is there a board involved? Should the board be involved in that respect? Those are some important considerations for this item. This one's a little bit longer, and so I'm going to give you a couple minutes or just a couple moments to review it. And this is, certainly one that we put together specifically because of some work that's happening in Michigan. So what we've got here, right, is a board that's struggling to be successful in the middle of a national pandemic. And as one of the requirements, the organization is required to establish learning plans that comply with a series of legal requirements, one of which is that the board must solicit public comment from the parents and legal guardians and students that are currently enrolled at the academy on a monthly basis. And so in this case, we've got a board member who also is a parent and, recognizes that the staff is doing, yeoman's work when it comes to this and wants to help out. And the way that they're going to do that is he's going to solicit some feedback from parents and their legal guardians after school while he's on campus picking their kids up. And then we'll share that information out with the board each month via email. This might feel like a real life case to you. Oftentimes, we've got board members who they want to join this board because they want to have an impact. And so we've got real, inspirational board members who might want to roll up their sleeves and do this kind of work. Is that appropriate? Is it not? Is it part of the board's responsibility? Is it part of Jonathan's role? Is there a role for the board? What is the role for the administration and the management team here? Where's the governance management line? The only thing that matters here is how would your organization handle this type of situation effectively? Because I'll tell you, whether it's something like this one, the real ambitious parent board member, or in my case, in a situation like staffing where parents, get really emotional about it and want to reach out. Well, it's important that if you had a conversation like this ahead of time, Jonathan may likely know that would be inappropriate for him to be doing certain things, where he's freelancing outside of the board's work and things like that. Or maybe with this organization, we've actually had a conversation about it and we've established that the board is going to own the process of soliciting that feedback. I think, it's important that you have these kind of conversations, and I think I will volunteer, either myself or the team over at CMU to, be in touch with if you have, questions about particular things like this in your team. And so finally, before we roll off of the subject, like I said, I would really encourage you to grab the slide deck is going to be made available. You can use these case studies. I can also give you some more if you're interested. But if you have 15 or 20 minutes at the beginning of a board meeting, it's a great kind of thing to just pause and say, or if you've got a light agenda, to say we're going to do some board governance work real quick, and we're just going to have a conversation about what good governance looks like and how we would handle these real life situations. Here are some indicators of when we see boards getting this work right. When we see boards that have struck a good balance, it looks like a full collaboration. It feels like a well-oiled machine. There isn't this feeling of the governance versus management, or there's no lack of clarity as to what the other side of the coin is working on. Everyone knows who's responsible for what, and importantly, the team, the number one indicator is that the team is able to tackle difficult topics together. Things don't get swept under the rug. We rip the Band-Aid off. We have the tough questions because we're not worried about, staff members aren't feeling like they're needing to protect their own job because that's at stake. The healthiest relationships that we have here really look like true honesty and open communication, where boards are able to tackle big issues in conjunction with one another, so it feels like a partnership. One of the ways that we're able to easily observe this is that we can often tell boards that are getting this balance right when we observe their board meetings, and even things just reporting out at board meetings. Boards that have more involvement from people other than just say the CEO or the board chair tend to have a healthier balance here. So you want to get your committees presenting at board meetings. You want your committee chair. You want your those other staff members. You want the full governance team to be involved in board meetings as well, and that's a good indicator. If a finance committee chair can get up and give a presentation on a draft budget, that really shows that we're involving more than just a handful of people in this work. All right, last few slides here. Just want to summarize, because we've been talking about a lot of theory and a lot of governance philosophy. And so I just want to wrap up by just, kind of quickly going through some high-level responsibilities of the board and how it fits into this stuff. At the top up here, I mentioned it in the Venn diagrams, that determining the mission, the vision, the purpose of the organization, what is it that we're here to do? And then importantly, to keep that clearly in focus. So, as let's say you're an organization where you may have had a founding school leader, they may be a passionate, charismatic, catalyst for the organization. They might develop good mission and culture. And then when that person leaves and you bring on a new staff member, to really the board's job to make sure that we are being true to who we set out to be, or to amend that mission. To that end, one of, if not the most important role of a board is to select, to support, to hold accountable by monitoring the performance of the school leadership, whether that's your CMO or your CEO or your executive director. It's really critical that ultimately, because remember, accountability ultimately flows through the board. It's critical that the board is monitoring the performance of the staff. Like I said, ensuring adequate financial resources for the mission. But the other side of that coin is maintaining fiscal responsibility and accountability. Again, financial oversight. It's that accountability stops with the board. It is the board's job to ensure that these public resources, the public monies that we're expending, these public assets, are being spent in conjunction, in accordance with the law and with our public mission. The board is responsible for setting the direction when it comes to monitoring and determining and strengthening the academic programming and servicing. This is really ultimately what we're here to do, right, is to educate students. This gets to the heart of, going back to my ship analogy, of the board pointing and say, this is where we want you to take us, and then the team finding a way to get there. The board is ultimately, again, getting back to accountability, the board is ultimately responsible for maintaining legal and ethical integrity of the organization, making sure that again, accountability stopping with the board, making sure that we're, abiding by relevant conflict of interest rules and open meetings laws and things like that. Ultimately, it's the responsibility of this board to keep the board going. And so that means orienting, recruiting, training new board members, maintaining this governance team. Well, I'm going to regret clicking back all this way, but I already started it. Everything related to growing up this path to excellence really is the purview of the board itself, just to reflect on its own governance work and to make sure that we're getting better. And we do that by making sure that we're bringing in new people on our governance board. Lastly, on this slide is being an ambassador of your organization in the community. So you are there to, promote the interests of this organization more broadly. That might mean, showing up at events like fundraisers or commencements, things like that. Being available in the community, keeping your finger on the pulse of the community, being an ambassador in general is one of those responsibilities. All right, final slide here is a little bit incongruous as to how we've arrived at this one, but I decided to put it in here because it is one of the, I think, most important tools that you can have on your board that can help to address a lot of what we've talked about that we see boards often missing. And that is having a CEO support and evaluation committee. And so the reason why I put this on here is that CEO support and evaluation really gets to the heart of a lot of what we've talked about today. And what we like to see is that boards oftentimes will check the box of doing an evaluation of their CMO or doing an evaluation of their executive director. But what we often see is that there's a missed opportunity to making this a year-round process. So what we like boards to have is a CMO or a CEO support and evaluation committee where their job is to meet either bi-monthly, monthly, quarterly, whatever the right cadence is for you, to have ongoing conversations about what are the goals on the staff side, also to measure performance against those goals, right? Getting back to that really, really, really important accountability tool. But then also it's an opportunity for the board leaders and the staff in a more intimate setting, so not in the full board, but in a smaller cohort, to have conversations about what's working and what's not working as part of this governance team. So imagine a scenario where your executive director has a board member who is like the Jonathan we just talked about a moment ago. Maybe that person is calling up principals and complaining about staff who were not retained, or they're doing, that thing about, soliciting feedback, whatever it might be. That CEO or that staff member, you remember, they have to walk this tightrope of both working for this board, but also providing leadership. And so it can be very difficult to have those conversations publicly, especially when you're talking about adult professionals, volunteers. So having this small entity is a great place to have a sounding board as to how the board is striking that balance that we've been talking about today about the board's role versus the staff's role. And so if you have any questions about this, like I said, we typically think it's best served in a committee form. And on our website at BoardOnTrack.com, showing here on every slide down here at the bottom, we have tons of free resources, including a sample job description that helps to explain the role of this committee. So with that, I have reached sort of the end of my portion here for right now. And I'd like to point out before we get to questions that if you want more info, like I said, you can always visit us at our website. We've got tons of free resources there. We love it if people take them, make them their own. So feel free to do that. So at this point, why don't I pause and let's see what, if any questions or if anything in this particularly resonated with you, maybe as something that you might, your board does particularly well, or you think might be an opportunity for your board. Would love to have you to type that in. If you have any questions about how to get in contact with me, if you want to continue the conversation, if you can't tell from this conversation so far, I tend to get pretty geeked out about this work, and so if you want to continue the conversation, I'm happy to hop on the line with any of you. So I think what we'll do is we'll pause here for a few minutes. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes to get through any questions we have. And if we don't have any questions live, like I said, I'm always available for follow-up if something comes to you after we disconnect today.
While we're waiting on questions, I just want to say a big thank you to Mike for joining us today. And as many of you have noticed, there's a lot of alignment between our belief system about the board at CMU and at BoardOnTrack, and we appreciate their partnership and their willingness to continue to share with our partners, the school board members and the schools that we authorize. And so I'm just going to circle back and see if we did have any questions. It doesn't appear that we do at this time. And so want to remind everybody that an evaluation will be coming your way. If you haven't done that already, please stick around and complete that evaluation so that we can continue to provide content that is valuable to you.
I think we actually get one here. Got a question right here. It's a really good one. You know, we talk about a lot, right? How about this note? I said it in my deck here about one of the, if not the most important thing that a board can do is to evaluate the other side of the coin. And so we got a question here, which is, you know, is there a difference between a CEO evaluation and a management company evaluation? And I think the answer is that it totally depends. And the reason why I say that is because some tools are ubiquitous. So, for example, at BoardOnTrack, we have a CEO evaluation tool that we promote, and people who work with us, our members, they use that evaluation tool for both an individual who would be like a CEO and the management company, if that's what they have as well. Other organizations that I've worked with in the past, they make more significant tweaks. And some CMOs will come to the table with a proposed, you know, set of evaluation criteria or a recommended process. The short answer is that in substance, they should not be substantially different, because the goal here is to measure the same. We have the same outcome, which is that we as the board need to ensure the ultimate accountability. And so going back, I'm hesitant to click through these slides again, but going back to the very first slide, it is CMU who is going to hold the board responsible. And so it's ultimately, if there's things that happen that go wrong, right? Like maybe we just don't hit our targets, or God forbid, there's something like fraud or mismanagement or financial mismanagement that happens within the school, it's ultimately the board's responsibility for preventing that or for fleshing that out. And so whatever we do, the criteria that we're looking for are to measure those key things, right? How do they manage the staff in the organization? How do they manage our finances? How do they manage the academic programming? Are we achieving those benchmarks that we've set out to achieve? Are we being operationally efficient? All of these kinds of things are the same types of criteria. You may phrase them differently based on your individual structure. But yeah, they should be very similar. They might look different, but in spirit, they should all be measuring the same thing. So that's a great question. Having said that, I think that's an important question because, you know, oftentimes it's less clear. And so I think it's really important for those organizations that have a CMO to have a conversation about who is on your governance team and to really flesh out what makes up your governance team so you have clarity about that structure.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you for taking and answering that question. It doesn't appear at this time that there are any additional questions, but I do want to remind everybody to please, if you do have additional questions, if a question comes to you in the future, please connect with your school lead. That's what they're there for, to help support you guys through some of these challenging, difficult scenarios that you face from time to time, and utilize the tools that have been provided as it relates to the case studies that are in the PowerPoint that will be available on our website. Those are great learning discussion tools for you guys to consider moving forward. And so just want to say thank you again to everybody for joining us. Thank you, Mike. and we will look forward to having another opportunity in the future to engage with you all on this interesting governance topic. And so thank you, everybody, and we will look to chat with you again soon.
Thank you.